Hello and welcome to a special bonus edition of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry. I'm your host, Andrew Gelina. Joining me remotely today is Mason Fitch. Mason, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew.
So Mason, you and I got the chance to work together a while ago and both quickly realized that we had 90 miles apart, had very similar experiences growing up being exposed to anime. How did you get your start?
Well, I was born in 75, and about the late 70s, there was a local TV station, WFXT, Channel 25, which later became a Fox affiliate. They were playing some imported anime things dubbed in English. Some things like Star Blazers and Battle of the Planets, and then especially the thing that really grabbed me was Force 5. Each day of the week, there was a different serialized giant robot show. So, like, for instance, I know on Thursdays, you could always watch Grendizer. And then on Fridays, you could always watch Guy King. And that was what really grabbed me. The Super Robot shows specifically. And then some of the toys that came out around that we were lucky enough to have some exposure to in Eastern Mass were things I really gravitated towards. So when we worked together, you and I both, and I don't remember how this came about, but we both found out that we had a real love for Guy King when we were kids. And that began some chatting on that.
Yeah, now you were fortunate enough to live near Mr. Big Toyland. And when I would watch those shows, it seemed like every other commercial was Mr. Big Toyland at 399 Moody Street in Waltham. So what was the first toy you got from there?
Now, I was young, and I'm pretty sure the first toy I got from there, from any of these shows, was from Guy King, was the Bazolar, which was the little Triceratops-shaped tank with a little drill nose. And that was maybe one of my favorite toys from childhood. Absolutely.
Yeah, there was a whole line of die-cast metal figures and toys that Mattel was pushing pretty hard at one point, but I think they ended up losing the rights to it or something like that.
Yeah, so Mattel put out a line that they fabricated called Shogun Warriors. And so that was the die-cast robots and vehicles and ships that you're talking about. And they also put out the hollow polyvinyl chloride robots that were in Japan were called jumbo machinders. And I don't actually know how they were differentiated in Shogun Warriors. I think they were just called 24-inch Shogun Warriors. And those are the ones that had the red and white missiles that were all interchangeable and the missile-firing fingers on Mazinger and all that. Those all came from a company in Japan called Popey that later morphed into Bandai, which a lot of us have heard of now. The die-cast toys were called Chogokin, which is Japanese for super alloy. And that was the mythical metal that Mazinger Z was made from, which is why it was indestructible. So there was the first Chogokin toy was Mazinger Z, and then they made a whole line of them called Chogokin based off of that metal, that fantasy metal. So Mattel started importing some of those. And then later in, I would say 82, Bandai started importing them directly under the name Godaiken or Godaiken. And you got some of the larger robots there, the big DX, the deluxe sets. There's such an interesting history with what got imported. So part of the Chogokin line was also 3 large super robots that also got imported separately by Matchbox under the Voltron name. So Voltron, the Lion one we know of, was actually Go Lion. And then there was Dyrigger 15 was like Voltron 2 or the vehicle Voltron because there were 15 of the separate vehicles. And the Voltron 3, which never got its own show over here, was El Bega. It's like Alpha, Beta, and Gamma because there were 3 robots that combined together. So many companies in America gathered toys from Japan in the late 70s and the early 80s and brought them over. I mean, that's what Transformers are. The first few waves of Transformers are rebranded Takara Microman and Micro Change and Diaclone toys. 3 separate toy lines under Takara that were all under the same design aesthetic. So you'll notice in Transformers, when the movie came out, the designs of the toys became much simpler and the construction was mostly plastic. And they took a drastic turn. And it's because it was the Hasbro designers trying to replicate what the Takara designers had done and really didn't.
Yeah, the detail in some of the Japanese toys, I mean, is that why the Popey ones now are like so much more valuable? You see them on eBay.
So there's a lot of reasons why older things become valuable. You know, it's always supply and demand. So if you consider a G1 Transformers Optimus Prime, those were made mass market for the United States and Canada and Europe. So far more units were made. And then years later, when people wanted them, a higher percentage of those survived. The original Popey toys were made for Japan, which has a much smaller population than all of the Western world. So I think they're in demand because even though there wasn't a push to market the original Popey toys in the US and in Europe, there were pockets of hyper popularity around the world for those at the time. In the Philippines, they really went crazy for a show called Voltus 5, which was also one of the Godeikin toys that came over. In the Middle East, there was a huge run on Grandizer. Grandizer is the Japanese name. So there is a huge following in the Middle East of Grandizer, as well as in Italy and Spain. And I might mess this up, but in Italy, it was called Goldrake, and in Spain, it was called Goldorak. When they imported it, they changed the name slightly like the US did. So around the world, there were pockets of this. And as children, we asked our parents or aunts and uncles or grandparents for toys, and we would get those toys based on the desires and whims and affordability from adults. And then we grow up and we get good paying tech jobs and a pinch of nostalgia and maybe some appreciation for the design. For whatever reason, you're getting into it, or multiple reasons. First of all, eBay and the internet in general is around. So you're able to research things, find things you used to remember, or things that you only were slightly exposed to. And now you're able to deep dive. And you're a big nerd with no kids and some income, and you deep dive.
But in the middle there, you actually got to Toy Zero. You were in a big family. A lot of the toys became hand-me-downs for your relatives and cousins and so forth. But then there was a fateful incident during college that started it all again.
Yeah, so I was the oldest cousin, and I had a lot of aunts and uncles, and I had some living grandparents at the time. So yeah, my birthday being in June and Christmas being in December, I had like an even distribution. And being the only grandchild for a while, I just made out like a bandit, an absolute bandit. And yeah, so the nostalgia bug bit me, and I was with a friend in college who was a comic book fan, and he dragged me into a comic book shop. This was about 95. I had an inkling to pick up, for whatever reason, a Star Wars comic book. That got me interested in that again, which I loved as a kid. And through that, I kind of was like, you know what? These comic book stores, they have old toys. I kind of want to get an old Kenner Stormtrooper, just a little 3 3/4 inch Stormtrooper, just to have it on my desk at college. There was no grand plan to collect toys. I just really liked that design. I think in all of science fiction, that's one of the best designs ever, is the Stormtrooper armor. And I fondly remember the toy as a kid. So through going around to different comic shops, seeing just what was in the shops at the time, because it was all new to me. I hadn't been in a comic shop since I was 12 years old. Getting exposed to more and more comics as I was looking for this Stormtrooper, getting more into comics, and coming across Spawn, the Spawn comic book, which was only at issue like 48 at the time, was my first issue. I started collecting some of the McFarlane Toys Spawn line, which were like really detailed. They weren't for children. They were like adult collectibles. And I started a shelf of those in my college dorm, and that kind of grew into more superhero comics, more superhero toys, till I eventually, and I did get the Stormtrooper, so more Star Wars toys as well. And then looking through, what was it called? There was Wizard magazine for comic books, and then they had an offshoot magazine called Toy Fair, which was like toy collecting news, monthly magazine. And there were some ads in there for some import places that had a Guy King toy. And I was like, oh, yeah. Oh, I completely remember that. I love that thing. I wonder how much that is. And it was like $125, which to a college student, it might as well have been $1 million.
It's a lot of ramen.
It's quite a lot of ramen. It's a lot of late night BLTs and chicken wings is what it was for me. Yeah. I tucked that away in my memory. And as I went around to more and more comic stores, I started to see some import things here and there. And I eventually did get that Guy King. And it scratched an itch. And, you know, I guess I was chasing the tail of the dragon. So I started looking around at some other Japanese toys. Yeah, exactly. And I found out about a store on Mass Ave in Cambridge called Day Old Antiques. It was this punk rock record shop, and the owner also sold some of these old toys. And both of those things appealed to me. So I went in, and right at the tail end of college, I started going in there and buying a few toys here and there, which at the time I thought they were very expensive. They were much more than retail was in the 70s and 80s. But 20 years later, I would kill to get those things at those prices. Like the Space Dragon, I remember the first time I went in, they boxed Shogun Warriors version of the Space Dragon. They labeled it the Cargosaur. I think it was $150, and it was in pristine condition. And I did not have $150 to blow on a toy. I had no idea of what it was worth at the time. I only know that that guy wanted $150 for it. Well, nowadays you'll pay $700 for it, a mint boxed one. So I do have one, but I kind of wish I grabbed that one at the time. I could have made do and gotten that, but whatever. I've got enough. I don't have any regrets.
So speaking of old stories, what is your version of the Red Ryder BB gun?
Oh my God. Yeah. So in the Godaken line, there was the largest metal robot I'd ever seen called Tetsujin 28. So Iron Man 28. And some people might remember that there was a cartoon in the 50s in the US. It was a Japanese cartoon that came over called Gigantor, that giant blue remote control robot. So this was the 1980 sequel, or I guess reboot of Tetsujin. And so in the Godaken line, it was 18 inches tall. And I found out more of this stuff later as an adult, but it wasn't die cast metal. So it wasn't hot metal poured into a die. It was steel formed like car parts. So like the rounded parts of the legs that were metal were actually steel plates pushed into a heated mold.
Oh, like stamped?
Yeah, like stamped, pressed like car parts.
Huh.
It was the only Shogun toy they ever did that for. It retailed between $60 to $80. The MSRP was $60 to $80, whereas all the other larger Godakens were like $40 or $50. And I went to Mr. Big Toyland. So I lived a 10-minute walk from Mr. Big Toyland. And
so jealous.
Yeah, I know. We didn't have a car, though, and we were pretty poor. You're probably not jealous of that part. But so, like, that was the toy store for me. I saw the commercials for and wanted to go to Toys R Us or Child World or any of that stuff, but that was all out on the highway. That was all down in Framingham on Route 9. So I rarely ever got out there. And Mr. Biggs was like, the toy store, that's what it was. And I went in there all the time. I went in there like once a week, probably. And I would constantly ask him if he had one in stock because I wanted to have it put on layaway, if you remember that. Put it on layaway for like my birthday or Christmas. And I was a 5-year-old kid when I was asking for this. And it happened over the course of like 2 or 3 years, which seems like forever in kid years. And they would constantly tell me, oh, we don't have any of those right now, but check back. And I would every week. So finally, I asked them, it was like an old couple that owned it, Arthur and I forget his wife's name. So one day I just said, well, can you sell me the one in the case? Because they had a display case with some of the stuff open so you could see it. And they had a carpeted counter. It was like a showroom. They would take it out of the case and show you the things that the toys did. And so one day I just said, could I buy the one in the showcase? And I very earnestly and simply asked a question of an adult. And I said, can I buy the one out of the case? And I said, I don't need the box. I don't care about that. And they were like, well, no, but if we sell the one in the case, then we won't be able to promote selling them.
You aren't selling any anyways.
Well, yeah, in a non-wise fashion, Andrew, if you can believe this about me. I said to them, I said, well, if you don't ever get any in stock, you don't need that one to sell any. And the wife got pissed at me. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her face. And me is like, I was probably 7 at the time. I was like, what did I do wrong? So I never got my Tetsujin 28 when I was a kid. And it always bothered me. Even as a teenager, I still wanted it. It was just so impressive. It was large. It was amazingly made. It had elevators in the legs. So all the metallic armor pieces were magnetized. And you could pull them off and show all the inner workings. And they had an elevator in the legs for little service robots and stuff to go up. It was incredible. And no toy in the US was like it. And that's why it just really grabbed me. It was physically and visually impressive. And it had fun gimmicks to play with. It just didn't happen. And that tortured me like that poor kid in A Christmas Story.
Did you ever end up getting it?
I ended up getting 2. And I have one to display with the closed armor and one to display fully open. Now, that wasn't really intentional. I don't buy multiples of toys. I don't hoard things. I don't keep things in the package to keep them pristine. Even if I buy a 40-year-old toy and it's taped shut still, I open it. And I'll put the stickers on it, and I'll cut pieces off the sprue and, attach them. Like for some people, it's all about preserving a piece of history or the authenticity of it. For me, it's about celebrating and loving the toy itself as an object of art, appreciating its design and its engineering, and looking at how beautiful it is and how impressive it is on a shelf, so I can see them every day.
To find my next job, first, I want to hear about dozens of jobs I am overqualified for.
Someday, I will talk to a recruiter who knows the difference between Java and JavaScript. That will be the one.
Would I mind commuting 3 hours each way each day? Of course not.
All I have to do is go through 5 separate interviews, complete a 10-hour coding exercise, and recite the national anthem backwards? I'm in.
Finding your next consulting gig should not be this difficult. Quite frankly, you deserve better. Syrinx is the consulting company founded and run by software consultants. We get you. Find out why our employees are some of the happiest and best paid consultants in the industry at syrinx.com. That's SYRINX.com. Find a better way today. Syrinx Consulting is a proud sponsor of Underserved, the podcast for the rest of the tech industry.
My office at home, I have 9 glass display cases around me right now as I speak. Someone asked me recently at work, and I counted them, 454 different vintage Japanese toys.
That is quite impressive.
Seems like a lot. But I didn't do this all in a year. I've been at this since 1998. So I got 2 Tetsujin 28s. I almost had one. This is a kick in the from hindsight. I went into a comic book store looking for Spawn figures in about 1997. And the comic book shop had a couple of Godakins. And they had the Tetsujin 28. And the owner of the shop, who shall remain nameless, and the shop shall remain nameless, had it up for $40. And I had $40. But I wasn't yet back into the Japanese stuff. And I was going to get a rarer chase figure from Spawn, the Malabologia, which was like the big Satan devil boss guy. And it was a big boxed figure where everything else was like a carded figure. They were kind of hard to get, and it was also $40. And that day, I looked at the Tetsujin, and I was like, okay, but I'm here on a mission. So I went and I got the Malabologia, which of course I no longer have, and I got rid of all that stuff. But I went back the next week, and I was like, hey, do you still have that big Godaken figure? And he's like, no, I sold it. I was like, oh, okay, bummer. And I came to find out from another customer, because I didn't know how much they were worth at the time. Someone came in that day and was like, hey, how much is that? And it's $40. He's like, I'll give you $100 for it. I don't have it right now. Let me go home and get it. And so he caught wind of this must be worth more. Someone else had come in the time that the guy had gone and come back, and he had sold it on him the next day. And he's like, well, a guy came in and he offered me, I think it was like $200 for it. And so the original gentleman who offered him $100 was like, you idiot. He's like, I would have given you $1,000 for that. So for being slimy, he paid the price. And for being stupid, I paid the price. This is how much of a geek I am. I was out at my friend's bachelor party right when iPhones came out, and I didn't have one myself, but there was an ongoing auction on eBay for a Tetsujin 28 that was loose, but with almost all the parts. And the parts it didn't have were like the duplicate parts, like the additional missiles. I only need 2 for that, so things like that didn't matter. It would display nicely. And I was constantly borrowing my friend's iPhone to log back into eBay to check it while we were out at a bachelor party. And came home that night and found out that I won it. It was the most expensive toy I had bought at the time. It was $997, so it wasn't 4 figures. And I had no regrets. And I remember I was working from home the day it was delivered, and I was working at my kitchen table on my laptop, and the box was there. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to open it. I'm going to be distracted. I don't want to open it for the sake of going through the paces of opening it just to say that it's open, just to see it. Like, I'm going to finish my workday, and at the end of the day, I'm going to shut my laptop, and I'm going to like relish opening this and take my time with it.
Look at you, the picture of delayed gratification.
Well, I mean, hell, I already waited 30 years. I think I was 34 years old when I finally got one. And it was loose. It was in good condition. Through some of the other friends and toy people that I've met, and going to like a lot of Japanese toy and hosting Japanese toy functions at my house, a friend of mine who had already had one, who bought another one to upgrade his and didn't need the torn up ratty box that it came in, gave me the box to complete mine, which was super sweet thing to do. So I had now a boxed one. And 5-6 years ago, my wife and I went to Japan, And I told her this has been kind of a lifelong dream of mine to specifically go toy shopping in Japan. And I mean lifelong, like literally when I was a kid, I would have loved to do it. And as an adult, I would have really loved to do it. And I said, I'm going to put aside some money before we go. And I'm not going to spend any money on toys between now and then. And this is my big hurrah. This was also my 40th birthday present, was she planned this whole trip. So we did a week in Tokyo and a week in Kyoto, more in the country. So the first week in Tokyo was toy shopping every day, among other things, but every day was toy shopping. And she goes, how much money do you want to put aside? And this is how you know she's a keeper. She says, how much money do you want to put aside? And I said, this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I'm going to put aside $5,000 just for toy shopping. Are you okay with that? She's like, yeah, didn't bat an eye. And so I had like a hit list of things I was looking for, which nowadays is not as easy because of the proliferation of online stuff. There's still a lot of dedicated collector shops in Tokyo, but the rent is very high in Tokyo. So the cost is very high. So you're paying a tax for the experience of doing it, which I was fine with. And I had trouble in a week spending $5,000, which is ridiculous. I mean, I saw so many things that were awesome, but they just weren't on my short list, so I didn't want to just blow it to blow it.
How'd you get it all home?
I shipped it. Oh, yeah. The hotel I was staying at packed it all up for me and shipped it home for me. And it was a big box, but it wasn't $5,000. So I came home and I still had about $3,000. And I happened to go into the comic book store that I used to work at, the Outer Limits in Waltham. And there was a gentleman, Steve Cohen, who was a customer, a very good customer since the store opened. He passed away. And he was buying everything, every month that came into the store. And in the 80s, he bought an actual Japanese Popey version of Tetsujin 28 in the box. And he was like just kind of a collector, hoarder. Like he just had this stuff in an apartment. And I don't mean his apartment. He had like a separate apartment where he just had stuff. So
Instead of a storage unit?
yeah, pretty much. So when he passed away, his wife was bringing in carloads at a time, things into the Outer Limit. And the owner was buying back everything, honor his old friend. And he had the Tetsujin 28, the Japanese box, like I said. And it's almost identical to the US one. There's a slight color difference. And he had it up for, I think, $1,800. Now, the toy's really worth like $3,000 or $4,000, boxed up and everything in the Japanese version. And I'd worked there for like 10 years. And he knew about the Mr. Biggs issue when I was a kid. His store was 2 blocks up and still is 2 blocks up from where Mr. Biggs was. Like, he knew that Arthur was opening Friday nights after hours to sell to adult collectors the Japanese Valkyries from Macross, which came to us as Robotech. So again, while he had those in the store, he never had them to sell. It's because he was selling them for, instead of the $60 to $80 MSRP, he was selling them for $300 on Friday nights to adults. And a lot of adults were nostalgic for this stuff because they remembered Gigantor from the 50s. So that's why they lied to me my whole childhood and told me that I couldn't have one. So
The adult after-hours gray market.
how ridiculous. I later grew up and through meeting a lot of people in Japanese toy collecting, I met one of the gentlemen who went in there and purchased them. And I told him, I was like, that's mine. You've got mine.
Now, in the car world, there's the idea of a barn find.
Right.
Where you're out in the middle of nowhere and you find some completely pristine 1960s muscle car that's been sitting there forever. Have you ever had any experiences in the toy collecting world where you wandered in and you're like, oh, they just have a pile of stuff that I'm going to buy all of it?
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, so I've come across some things. There's a couple of stories like that. Bullmark was another company that was a competitor of Popey, so they started doing the giant Japanese robot, the giant diecast toys. And they were also known for doing a lot of their Sofubi, the soft vinyls of Godzilla and Ultraman. That was kind of their real bread and butter. But they did some like giant Godaken-sized sets. And I was at a place in Seattle visiting a friend. It's called Gasoline Alley. And it's like a tiny 500 square foot little store. And the guy had just toys of all types from all decades, from floor to ceiling. And it was hard to see everything because it was just a wall of stuff. And we were there for like an hour looking at stuff. And he was kind of like a flea market kind of mentality. So he didn't know everything he had. He wasn't a collector himself, not of everything he had. And I found a DX Bullmark toy. And it wasn't one of the ones that I particularly was super fond of for the money. Like, it was something that was going to be around $2,000. And I didn't $2,000 like it. So on the way out the door, I looked above my head and I saw a Bullmark logo buried under some stuff. And I was like, oh, hold on a second. What's this? And you know how like stores have the window above the door with the AC unit? It was stuffed above the AC unit and it just happened to catch my eye. I asked the guy to get it down for me because I wanted to see what it was. And he was like kind of grumpy to like have to go get that because I guess he didn't want to make money. So I convinced him to take it down because I like to buy it, but I want to see if all the parts are there. And I looked and everything was there and I couldn't believe it. And I was like, how much do you want for this? He's like a flea market kind of guy. He's like, I don't know. That's been sitting around for so many years. I'd have to look at my records and see what I paid for it. And I was like, this guy doesn't have records. Blowing smoke up my I said, well, what do you think you want for it? And he's like, well, why don't you come back tomorrow? I was like, look, I'm literally only in town for a day visiting a friend. I would like to buy this. What do you want for it? And he said, what do you think's fair? And I said, I don't really know, like $300. To which he said, no, it's got to be $500. I said, you just told me you don't know what it's worth. I'm telling you, it's worth like $300. And I really wasn't sure. I knew it was worth more than that, but I didn't know how much more at the time. So and I was with two friends of mine who were like really into this toy collecting too, and they weren't sure, but a friend of one of the guys that was there has one, and I know that he just sold it in this big suitcase set, and they also sold it separately in 3 parts. Kind of like they sold the Voltron lions as one big gift set, or they sold them in the arm set and the leg set and the body separately. Well, just the headpiece for this alone had sold loose for $500 a few days before this trip. And I was like, well, I know this thing's worth some money. And I said, listen, I'm only in town today. I'd like to give you $500 for it. I don't have $500. I have $450 in my pocket right now. And he kind of hemmed and hawed. And I'm like, look, it's been sitting here for X years. You don't even know what it's worth. Why won't you take $450 for it right now? Because I'm not coming back tomorrow with $500. So he very begrudgingly and surly sold it to me for $450. The second we left the store, we got on the phone with our mutual friend who said, you just made a complete score because that thing's worth at least $2,000. Wow. And I was like, okay, all right. And again, went to the hotel I was staying at, shipped it home. There was also a toy museum in Maine. And I forget what town, but it's down the street from Moody's Diner, if you know that place with the pies, on Route 1. And it's a guy's house, and half of his house is a dedicated toy museum, like back from the 30s to current. He's got literally half his house is sectioned off, and it's a pretty cool little place. And he's got a gift shop. And his gift shop is just like toys that he rotates out of displays, I guess. And he had a bunch of Godakins. And I went up there with the next girlfriend to go to a bed and breakfast up on the coast, nice weekend, and I saw a toy museum. I was like, hey, let's pull over. And on a whim, we pulled over, went in, and you enter and exit through the gift shop, which maybe is not as underhanded as it sounds because it's just the guy's house. He doesn't have a lot of space.
He took a page out of Disney. I respect
that. Well, so even before going through the museum, I happened to just be poking around, and the gift shop is probably living room sized gift shop, literally a living room. And I grabbed 3 Godakins in absolute mint condition that he wanted like $20 a piece for, that at the time were going for between $200 and $500. So that's probably my closest to a barn find.
Right on. What would you say is kind of a underrated toy? We talked a bit on the pre-call about Mobile Suit Gundam might be a candidate for that.
Yeah, so Mobile Suit Gundam, man, that's been going on for about 40 years, and some of the toys are less appreciated than they should be. So Clover, another competitor trying to keep up with the juggernaut that was Popey and then Bandai in the boys robot toys field of the 70s. So all the 70s robots were like what they refer to as super robots. So they were kind of like more super heroic, like ridiculous designs. Nothing realistic, and I use that term loosely. And then Mobile Suit Gundam came around, and it was not even really necessarily a show just for kids. It had a giant robot, but it was treated more like military mecha. It wasn't a hero in and of itself. It was just a piloted piece of machinery. It was like a tank. In the super robot shows, like those things didn't ever get damaged. Every week a new thing would come up, and they'd split it in half, and it would be done. Well, in Gundam, there was like an ongoing, more soap opera-like storyline really focused on the horrors of war as seen through these orphans who get picked up on this traveling warship after their colony gets blown apart. And the robot itself, like I said, it was more mechanically designed, and it started the genre called mecha as opposed to robots. So mecha being things that came along later that you may or may not have heard of called votoms or Bang of the Sun Dugram. So Vodems and Dugram had a lot of mecha designs that were essentially stolen by FASA Games when they made the Battletech game. So like all of those more realistic angular robots were taken from Robotech and Macross and from those other two properties. But anyway, Clover came out with this another DX figure of the Gundam. And none of these toys were designed exactly like they looked in the show. They didn't mimic the source material. They didn't mirror the source material. The designers really put some passion in it. They made play features and spring-loaded features and just things that just didn't happen on the show, but it made the toys so much fun. And as kids, not seeing most of these shows and just getting the toys through Mr. Big, I was just all for it. That Gundam toy is pretty underappreciated because it looks like a super robot designed toy with the gimmicks and the colors that don't match. Like, it's got chrome legs, and if you've ever seen the Gundam, it's got a blue torso with white arms and legs. And, some spot colors here and there. But the toy has weapons that weren't in the show, just like a whole bunch of gimmicks. I think that's an underrated toy. The vintage collectors don't really appreciate. I mean, some people certainly do, but for the price it's commanding now, yes, they certainly do. But it's nowhere near as popular because it was also not the company, the juggernaut that was putting out, again, back to supply and demand. There weren't as many Gundam toys put out. And actually, Clover made those few toys, and the toys didn't really sell because the show wasn't really aimed at kids because of the subject matter. So it was kind of a left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. But then Gundam started making plastic model kits. Bandai started making them. And that has been a billion-dollar industry for Bandai, just Gundam kits throughout different Gundam series. This year is the 40-year anniversary. It's insane the amount of units and kits and money that property has generated.
Underserved is brought to you by Cyrix, the developer-founded, developer-run software consulting company. Do your kids want to see you at more of their soccer games? Does your daughter want you to come to her dance recital? Does your son want you to help him with his homework, then maybe watch a show together? Of course they do. But it's getting harder and harder for you to have family time because you have to put in so many hours at the office to get your mountain of software projects completed and out the door. And you can't hire people fast enough in such a tight job market to help you catch up. If this is you, then it's time to call Cyrix. We have consultants who can slot into your team immediately to make a positive impact on your schedule. We help you ship software on time and on budget. And we help you get back time to do the important things in life, like having a life. Let us get started today. You could reach us at 888-579-7469, option 1. That number again is 888-579-7469, option 1. Or you can email us at info@syrinx.com. That is info@syrinx.com. More time with your family, brought to you by Syrinx.
But to talk about the gimmicks that don't belong there, I had one toy when I was a kid from Mr. Biggs, and I remember getting it on my 7th birthday. And it was one of those things where someone brings you to the toy store and says, you can pick what you want. And I picked this. It was a die-cast Godzilla toy from Bullmark. And I don't know if you ever remember seeing that there. So Mr. Biggs was interesting because they had Godaikin stuff, and they had a distributor to get that through. But all the other toys they had buyers just buying random stuff off of toy shelves and bringing it back. So, like, they didn't carry toy lines the way that if you wanted a Star Wars toy and you went to Toys R Us, they were more than likely going to have it because they had 30 of it. That's not the way this worked. So they had this one die-cast Godzilla toy that was about 5-6 inches tall with a rubber tail so you could, like, wag it and move it back and forth. But the very interesting thing was the chest was hinged down near the crotch. So, like, under the neck opened up and it swung down on a hinge near the crotch. And on the inside of it were tanks and some launching missiles out of the chest and a jet. So it was like a hangar. And
this does not sound like Godzilla canon.
No, it didn't. And there was a telescoping seat that came out with 2 pilots. And as a child, it really captured my imagination, and I did not understand it at all. And I had to have it because I needed to understand it. And as a child, I never did. I rolled around in my head as like, is this supposed to be like a snap-up, fold-up playset where they include the enemies, like the tanks and the jets that they're always sending after Godzilla? But then that didn't work because, well, why would he launch missiles himself if it was just the enemy stuff inside? I was like, is this supposed to be Mecha Godzilla which in the movie, it had a Godzilla-like skin on it, but then it came off and you realize it was a robot underneath, but it didn't look anything like what Mechagodzilla looked like underneath and, piloted in that way. And I could never wrap my head around it. And I don't have any of these toys from when I was a kid, by the way. I don't have anything from when I was a child. It all went to my younger cousins or donated or whatever. I bought another one and it just brought me such joy when I got it. And I still didn't understand the damn thing at all. I love it and I don't get it. And I talked to other adults who are, really into this stuff. Nobody understands it. I have a friend, Matt Alt, who lives in Japan. He's written some books. He has some ins with a lot of the media in Japan. He has a translation company. He's really in with a lot of higher ups at Bandai and different toy companies. He has ins. He has never gotten a straight answer as to what the hell this thing is. It was just some mad designer was like, I'm going to put these super fun features in here that make zero sense and it's going to make kids really happy. And it totally did.
Very cool. If folks want to figure out more about the hobby or collecting, are there any good websites, Facebook groups, things they should check out?
Yeah, plenty. My favorite is Toybox DX. So toyboxdx.com started in 98, and I started searching this stuff in 99. And it was a friend of mine, Alan Yen, who started that site. So there was a BBS on there, which is now defunct, as you might imagine, because I said BBS. But they have the data file section. And so it's like all the different companies, they have a photo of almost every one of the major Japanese toy lines, each toy, the box, the inside, the toy itself, all of that. And that's still a great resource. And then there's a Toybox DX Facebook group as well, which is where all the discussion migrated. There's a lot of other ones, but that's like the one.
Very cool. So what was your introduction to Akira like? And what were you like pre and post seeing Akira?
Yeah, so I like some anime. I'm not like a real super anime fan or anything, but I like what I like. And there's quite a bit of it I do like. So in the 90s, a lot of anime was starting to come out on VHS, either subtitled or dubbed through Manga Anime was the company that was doing a lot of that. And you're on a college campus, those tapes, they make the rounds and you get to see some stuff. I had a buddy, Doug, who was a film major, was like, oh, if you like that stuff, have you seen Akira? I'd never heard of Akira. He said, come to my room right now. And he sat me down and made me watch Akira. And it was beautiful. The animation, the sound, the music, the mood, the tone, all of it was gorgeous. And it didn't make any goddamn sense. And at the end, afterwards, he explained to me that the comic that came out, or the manga that came out, was like 6 or 7 big phone book sized volumes. And he had only written the first volume when the film company started, or bought the rights, and they were like, well, we're going to start making the movie now. And he's like, I'm not done. I'm not done writing it. In hindsight, yes, this sounds an awful lot like Game of Thrones and how that ended. So if you read the books, which I later did, Dark Horse put them out in like 99, 2000, and I devoured them. It's a great story. Probably one of my top 5 comics ever. It's really just superb. And what you realize is that the film, 80% of it is that first volume, and the last 20, and I'm being generous calling it 20%, is like the last volume and a couple bits and pieces in the middle. So I would say a lot of people have seen Akira, and they either love it or they don't like it because they didn't understand it. I would say it's very much worth reading the comics and then going back and watching the film, because you get the full story from the comics, but you get the absolute masterpiece that is that film to watch.
Very cool. So it sounds like your wife has been very tolerant and supportive of your hobby gone bad. Do you have any stories along the way with her?
I do. So between this and comic books and miniature gaming, I have expensive hobbies, and I used to be a car tuner, and that's a ridiculously expensive hobby, as you may or may not know, Andrew. So all that stuff together, but I can pay the bills, so it's never been a problem. And she told me something when we first started dating. I said, is this kind of weird, this stuff? And she goes, no. She goes, if anything, it's interesting because it shows me that you're passionate about something. So it's only been a boon, and it hasn't been a hindrance. And she celebrates it. Like, she doesn't know all of this stuff, and she doesn't have a ton of interest in it, but she's very interested to hear my passion for it. She was very interested to go to all the Japanese toy stores with me in Tokyo and go treasure hunting. That was fun for her too. Now, she is 9 years younger than me, so we didn't grow up in the same generation. So she didn't have any of this stuff around. And she's a bit nerdy too. And I don't mean geeky. So like geeky are people who are passionate about things, and nerds are people who are like smart and into scientific stuff. That's the delineation I make. She went to RIT, and the male to female ratio is ridiculous. So she asked the billions of guys she went to college with, and she went there for design, so they're all interested in stuff like that. She said, hey, when I was a kid, I had this toy that my mother's friend's son gave us as a hand-me-down, and it was this black and white robot, and it had like a hood that would pull up over its back like a hood on its head. And everyone was like, and these people didn't grow up in the G1 Transformers era, and they're like, I don't know, it just sounds like Transformers. And it definitely wasn't. And after seeing my stuff, she was like, oh, she said the same thing to me. And I said, yeah, I don't know, it doesn't sound very familiar. It definitely doesn't sound like any Transformers I know, but like I got out of that early, so it could have been some later Transformers. And maybe it was about a year into our relationship, and she had already moved in. We were sitting in the living room one night, and she mentioned that toy again. And I said, you know what? Why don't you draw it for me? Like, she's a very talented artist. I said, why don't you draw it for me? And she started to draw it, and instantly I was like, wait a minute. And I walked into the other room and I said, is it this? And she's like, oh my God, that's my toy, but it's big. So Popey it was the Biome Robo in the Godaken line. Hers when she was a kid. So I had the DX, so that's like the 10-inch tall one. She had the ST, which is standard size. So that was maybe 5 inches tall. The DX one is like 2 spaceships that combine to make this big robot. But the ST one is the robot just kind of lays down and the cockpit slides up over the back onto the head. And that's what she was talking about, the hood. And it didn't have the hands that spring-loaded shot off or the shield or the sword. And so I didn't have the ST one. I only had the DX one. So the next day I got on eBay, found a mint ST one, and I bought it. And I presented it to her. So she now has a toy. This isn't just my toy, it's ours because she has one in it.
Okay, so it's 453 and 1?
Oh, you know what? Yeah, actually, you're right. To be fair. Yeah, that's right. I was going to say 453 and a half to a half. But no, you're right. That's hers. And when I gave it to her, she took it out of the box and I showed her how to transform it and put the stuff on it. And she goes, wait a minute. She took the fists off and she put the quote-unquote hood up. And said, that's my toy. So that's how she has it displayed, is missing the accessories and with the jet part up over the hood.
Very nice. Well, she's been a very good sport. You're lucky to have
lovely.
her.
She's awesome.
I am similarly blessed with a wife that indulges my hobbies gone bad.
I'm well aware. She's a good person.
Thank you.
I think you may or may not have damned me when you found out that I lived a 10-minute walk from Mr. Big Toyland. That was pretty much the reaction I got from everyone in college who watched these cartoons, saw the commercial for all the Force 5 toys and the Star Blazer and Yamato toys at 399 Moody Street, Waltham. And to me, it was just a toy store. Like I said, like I was pining to go to the big box toy store because it was like huge and there was just aisles and aisles of things. It's not that I didn't like Mr. Big. I definitely did, but I didn't know how good I had it. And so many people, many people, even especially in the Japanese toy collecting hobby, when I tell them that I grew up down the street, they were like, that was like Mecca. That must have been insane. I'm like, yeah, it kind of was. It kind of was. So it's funny, you mentioned Mattel bringing over the Shogun Warriors line. Popey came to Arthur and his wife because they were buying from distributors in Japan. And they said, would you like to be our distributor in the U.S.? So this little mom and pop store in Waltham, Massachusetts, and this like giant company came to them and was like, can you do this? And they were like, no, we're just an old couple that has a toy store. We don't have a distribution center. Like, we can't do this. They also asked Forbidden Planet in Manhattan, if you've heard of that place. Mm-hmm. And they also asked Kimono My House in Emeryville, just across the bridge in San Francisco, technically in Oakland. And those 3 stores were all importing direct at the time, all these toys. And that's how they started shopping around the license, and that's how Mattel ended up bringing over Shogun Warriors, because Popey had an interest to hit this gigantic market, this very populous, heavy market. So Kimono My House was another wonderful store on the West Coast. So similarly to Mr. Big, it was a mom and pop. It was actually Yuki, and I never met his wife. She passed away before I met him. So I made a pilgrimage out there one year. I went to Comic-Con in San Diego, and then with my friend, we were like, hey, let's go up to San Francisco and hit up for a few days after we've been out here for a week blowing stupid fun money. We went up to San Francisco and we stayed up there for a few days, and we went to Kimono My House and bought a ton of stuff off of them, and we got to hear his story. His wife had a kimono shop, and every, I don't know how often, a couple months, they would fly back to Japan, go to stores, hand pick a bunch of kimonos, and fly them back. And in doing this, he started getting interested in the 70s in these robot toys. So he would sell a few in the window of his wife's store. And then later on, I don't know when, I think in the 80s, it full on just became like all robot toys. It was all that stuff. It was an interesting store because it was on the rooftop of a warehouse. So you had to walk up a fire escape to get up to the top of the store. And you're like, this can't be right. I'm not going the right way. And you get up to the roof and there's a 6-foot-tall Ultraman statue in front of a building on top of the warehouse. And you're like, yeah, that's definitely the right place. He passed away, but before he retired, he had kind of a going out of business sale. And that's kind of a big deal in our community. So someone organized a weekend retreat where like we went, and people from all over the world, we met up there and had like a weekend long party and bought out just so much stuff that he had.
That's cool.
He was a good guy.
Good way to wrap it all up. So, Mason, thank you very much for joining us on this special bonus edition of Underserved to talk about anime and more specifically, the toys from it.
Sure. Thank you. It was my pleasure. Maybe we'll talk about tech sometime.
One of these days on a future episode of Underserved.
All right.
Wolfam has exciting news for Force 5 and Star Blazer fans. A large variety of Force 5 and Star Blazer action figures are still available only at Mr. Big Toyland, Wolfam. The Force 5 and Star Blazer collections include an incredible array of Shogun Warriors, robots, and ships made of high-quality plastic and die-cast metal. These figures and models feature incredible detail, and construction will offer the collector years of enjoyment. Visit Mr. Big Toyland on 399 Moody Street.